Hello, and thank you very much for asking me to speak today to you at the 23rd International Conference on Grey Literature. My name is Toby Green. I'm the co-founder of Coherent Digital, but you might know me better in my previous life as being the head of publishing at the OECD. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the challenges of taming content from NGOs, IGOs and think tanks. That's non-governmental organisations, intergovernmental organisations and think tanks. And I'm going to be putting this in the context of both the scholarly record and grey literature. Now, the Prague definition of grey literature says that it stands for the manifold document types produced at all levels by governments, academics, business and industry. I certainly agree with the idea that there's many different types of grey literature, but I think there's something missing from the definition or the limitation that is just governments, academics, business and industry. Of sufficient quality to be collected and preserved by libraries, I certainly would agree with this, but I think I might phrase it slightly differently and say that it is content of sufficient quality to be part of the scholarly record. The final piece I also think there's a problem with. I'll come back to that in a second. But let's go back to the content produced at all levels by government, academics, business and industry. Well, where are the IGOs, the NGOs and the think tanks? They're not government. They're not academics, they're not business or industry, and yet they're producing a vast amount of very valuable content. So perhaps the elephant in the room, being grey literature, has got another elephant in the room, which is where is the content from the IGOs, NGOs and think tanks. And what about this point about publishing is not the primary activity of the producing body? Well, I was head of publishing at OECD for 20 years. Plainly, publishing is not the primary activity of the OECD. So does that mean that the OECD was producing grey literature? I think not. The OECD's content is as much part of the scholarly record as that of learned societies. So why is that? We'll come back to that later in the presentation. Let's take a quick look at other definitions of grey literature. Taryn Rudczynski, in her wonderful 2015 paper, The Elephant in the Room, described grey literature as being the chameleon of information resources in that it can constitute virtually anything and be written for and by anyone in almost any format. And I really like that definition because it suggests that grey literature is a very democratic form of content. But goes on to suggest that grey literature has a problem. It's very difficult for the librarian to handle. This is well summed up by McDermott in 1995, who said, you know you have grey literature when you can't place a standing order for it. What that really means is, no, I can't get this content through the regular supply chain. Natarajan also noted that grey literature is not searchable or accessible through the conventional search engine or subject directories. So here we have content that's plainly valuable, but it presents a difficulty for the librarians to collect. You can't get it through the standing order systems, you can't get it through the regular supply chain, and it's hard to find. It's not in the main discovery systems. So perhaps this leads to my own definition of grey literature, which is it is valuable stuff that's hard to find, difficult to use, and might disappear. Now, how does grey literature stack up against the formal scholarly record? Well, grey literature plainly holds a number of advantages. It's much faster to publish. There's greater flexibility in the content types. But there is plainly a complex interrelationship with scholarly journals, or perhaps better to describe it as being a complex interrelationship with the scholarly record. Journals and books are plainly valuable stuff that's easy to find, easy to use, both now and in the future because it is well preserved. That is therefore the scholarly record, and it's a record because it is easy to find, easy to use, and it is preserved into the future. Whilst on the other side you've got valuable stuff that's hard to find. It's difficult to use, difficult to cite, and it might disappear. So one could call it stuff that's not in the scholarly record, which gives us a rather ugly acronym, STNITSR, which almost spells sinister. It is sinister stuff. Now, the other day at a NISO event, and I gave a similar presentation, I posed the question, is there an invisible far side to the scholarly record? So if the near side is the record that we can see from Earth, is there a far side where this sinister content is invisible? Now, if you didn't know it already, tidal lock means there's only one side of the moon is visible from Earth. But the sides are very different, and that's maybe something you didn't know. I certainly didn't know until very recently. The near side has dried up lava fields. That's the grey splodges. The far side doesn't. This is just to illustrate the fact that you've got a side that we can see that's very different from the side that we can't, which is not a bad analogy for the scholarly record that we can see and the grey literature that we can't. If the near side represents the part of the scholarly record we can see and analyse, and it certainly is analysed, as you can see all those organisations produce a lot of data about how big the market is, the number of journals, the number of books and so on, then is there scholarship hiding on the far side? Now we know it's a vast body of content, but how vast? Now it might be good to illustrate this with a real example. And the other day, Yale put out a list of 12 timely reports that it recommended anyone who was following COP ought to read. What I thought was really striking was that only one of the 12 reports was published in the scholarly record. It was an article in the Lancet. All of the other 11 timely reports recommended by Yale are not in the scholarly record. They were published informally on various organisation websites. Now you could ask the question, do they count as scholarship? Should they take their place in the scholarly record? Because after all, grey literature has often been vilified, is often thought of as being junk science, science for hire, or the result of shoddy scholarship. So let's look at these 11 reports in a bit. So is this far side stuff trustworthy? Has it been peer reviewed? Well, this is a list of the 11 organisations that produced these reports. The IPCC doesn't really need much of an introduction if you follow climate, but I would just note that the authors of the IPCC reports are almost all academics who would normally be writing in books and journals. So we have the same author base producing the IPCC content. IISD is an NGO based in London. The IEA is an international organisation. In fact, it's an offshoot of the OECD based in Paris. Chatham House, very well known think tank in London. Less well known is the Sustainability Institute. It's a much smaller, more recent organisation, but producing really interesting work on sustainability. WMO and UNICEF are both UN bodies, the World Meteorological Organization and UNICEF. UNICEF, you may be more familiar with their Christmas cards, but they also produce research reports. Now the next one's interesting. This is Yale. So this is Yale not publishing as a book, not publishing in journal form, but publishing as grey literature. America is All In is a group that was set up during the Trump administration by mayors and philanthropists and other leaders in America who wanted to try and keep America in the Paris Climate Accord. The British Academy, perhaps better known for their arts, but in fact they're also producing research on climate, and that's the logo for the White House. Now I think you would all agree that these organisations are trustworthy. But is their work peer-reviewed? Well, a study done by Amanda Lawrence in 2017 showed that organisations like these do indeed put their content through an expert review process before it's published. And certainly in my own experience, having worked at the OECD, with the IEA, and with a lot of other international organisations and NGOs, my observation is that yes, their content is reviewed, expert reviewed, a bit like peer review, but simply that the process is different. But the content is reviewed before it's published, and for a very good reason. The funding for these organisations is entirely dependent on their reputation, and their reputation is only as good as their last publication. So plainly, they have every interest and every incentive to make sure that they're putting out quality content. So why is this far side stuff not visible in the scholarly record? And this is where I think the Prague definition almost gets it right, but not quite. I don't think it's a function of whether publishing is a primary activity of the producing body or not. Rather, it's a function of who is doing the publishing. Near-side stuff is released by publishers. Far-side stuff is released by organizations that lack publishing skills. They don't employ people with the skills necessary to prepare content for the scholarly record. It's not so much a function of what the organization is, it's a function of who they're employing. Near-side stuff is released by publishers that employ people who know how to prepare content for the scholarly record. They know how to prepare both the metadata and to use the right management systems, the M&M, so that the content can be found in the scholarly record. This was why, therefore, the OECD and learned societies produce content for the scholarly record. They employ people that have those skills. Far-side organizations, by contrast, do not employ people with publishing skills. They self-publish it, but they don't know how to prepare it for the scholarly record. And this allows, in fact, the Grinch to get in between the content and the audience to make it hard to find, hard to use, and why sometimes the content even disappears. So the scholarly record stuff is tamed by professionals who understand how to prepare the metadata and management systems so that the content is easily found, it's easy to cite, and it's preserved in the long run. So there, the list of all those logos are the infrastructure that wraps around the content so that it forms the scholarly record. By contrast, far-side stuff lives in the wild. It's untamed, it's unmanaged. It is not wrapped in the same metadata. It is not doesn't use the same management systems, so that the content is lost to the scholarly record, and sometimes is even lost altogether when links break. But I wonder if it's really a matter of perspective. The near-side scholarly record is captured, prepared, and designed for libraries and scholars. It's almost as if we're standing on the moon, on the near side of the moon, where we have all these systems, the DOIs and the NISOs and the OCLCs, wrapping the content with one view only, that of the Earth, which is the libraries and the scholars that are using the scholarly record. By contrast, far-side publishers are looking to a very different primary audience. They want to reach influencers, politicians, and sometimes a broader public altogether. For them, it's not a function of there being a Grinch hiding their content. Quite the reverse. They're employing communication specialists who are skilled at getting their content to influencers, to politicians, and the public. Which gives us, in fact, content looking in two different directions. You've got the scholarly publishers preparing content for libraries and scholars, and you've got far-side organizations preparing their content for influencers, politicians, and the public. They're simply the same content, but being looked after by people who are looking in two very different directions. You can see this if you look at the websites of far-side organizations. So, for example, the British Academy website has got a lovely button that says, read, watch, listen. So it's very attractive for the public, and it raises the expectation that, hey, here I can find content to read, watch, and listen. The trouble is that you won't find their reports there. They're hidden elsewhere on the website, presumably because they didn't think these reports are ready for a broad public. The IPCC has got a problem in the sense that they wrap their content in jargon. So unless you're familiar with the IPCC jargon, it's really hard to navigate their website. So their primary audience are those in the IPCC system. They're not looking to a broader set of scholars, and certainly not thinking about the librarians. Chatham House rebuilt their website about 18 months ago. When they did that, they broke every single link to their publications. And when they rebuilt their website, a fifth of the publications were not put back. Why? Because they thought they were too old. They would no longer be of interest to influencers, to politicians and the public. They weren't thinking of the libraries. They weren't thinking of scholars. And the White House website, well, I wish you luck trying to find the report that Yale listed. So how big is this problem? How much content from IGOs, NGOs and think tanks is missing from the scholarly record? Well, we're beginning to understand this as we build out Policy Commons, which is the new project that I'm working on. So far, we've pulled together 2.7 million items from 7,500 organisations, and we've done this in just under 2 years. But it's striking that we've already assembled 21,500 organisations in our organisation directory, so we plainly have a long way to go. And I would say that as we're still finding new organisations to add into Policy Commons, there's more headroom yet in terms of looking for content from IGOs, NGOs and think tanks. Just to put this into context, there are 35,000 journals recorded in URICs. That's not a million miles away from the 21,500 organisations we've already identified. Sort of gives me this sort of interesting idea that perhaps for every journal there's an IGO, NGO or think tank out there producing content, and their content is missing from the scholarly record. And this is why we've developed our Commons platform, on which we've built both Policy Commons and Mindscape Commons, which is our other service. We're seeking to tame wild far-side stuff and make it part of the scholarly record. So Policy Commons so far has got reports, datasets, charts, maps, blog posts, videos, papers, and yes, articles and books too, because there's no particular reason why this content can also be discovered alongside the grey literature. Mindscape, we're already putting together videos and VR experiences, and this is really just to demonstrate the point that our platform is content agnostic. It doesn't mind whether we're looking at a PDF file or whether we're looking at a VR experience. Behind the scenes, we have crawlers and filters that go and fetch the wild far-side content from these 7,500 websites, and then we tame it with scholarly metadata and prepare it for the management system so it can join the scholarly record. So what else does our Commons enable? Well, we can hold details about organisations, much as a journal publisher would hold details about a journal. Not only are we pulling content from those organisations, but we're listening to our members, and we'll actually go out and get the content that they want. So this becomes like a community effort, so that the universities and the governments that are using Policy Commons can ask us to go and retrieve the content that they need. Once the content is in Policy Commons, we tag it so that it can be classified and found easily. And we're beginning to add value to the content, make the content more useful. So we've just released a tool that extracts tables from PDFs and then allows the user to export the data from the table as a CSV file, so they can put it into their favorite spreadsheet system. There's no way we're going to be able to upload all the content ourselves. So we have an upload tool whereby individual users can upload their own content from their research teams or their projects, and that they can also not only link documents, they can link to resources. So they could link to an interactive website, for example. Once the content's in Policy Commons, we can then export marked records so that the content can begin to be discovered alongside other records in library systems. And we use other standard features, like, for example, counter usage data. So it's all about wrapping the content with metadata and standardizing that so that it can join the scholarly record. This is what a record looks like inside Policy Commons. So here we have a map that was put out by NASA using IPCC data. Now, interestingly, if you go to the IPCC website, you won't find any mention of this map. It's only living on the NASA website. Well, we've pulled it together with the IPCC content so that you can find it alongside the rest of the IPCC content inside Policy Commons. There's a summary which serves as an abstract for every item. We have author field for the author details if we can find them. A lot of this content actually has no author. And as I mentioned earlier, we tag according to the topics. We create a downloadable citation to make the content easier to cite, complete with a persistent identifier. Now, we don't use the DOI here because we're not the publisher or the owner of the content, so therefore we can't issue a DOI, but we issue our own identifier that is compatible with the DOI system. And if you're not sure of the origin of the content, you can click on the logo and link through to the organization record to learn more about the organization. And we just recently launched a list tool whereby our users can create lists either for themselves, so they can keep a record of a reading list for themselves, or they can make a reading list for a class that they're giving, or they can even, as Yale were doing, issue a list as recommended reading. And of course, everything is pulled together and held together by a search engine with a ton of facets to help you find the far side content that you're looking for. So in summary, we're taming IGO, NGO and think tank content so that it can take its rightful place in the scholarly record. So we're pulling that content from their websites through Policy Commons and can therefore export the content and have it so it is, for example, discoverable in Google Scholar, which I hope will happen very soon, as well as being available inside library systems, and we're also preserving the content as we go. Now, my last point is this. In 2014, there was the PISA Declaration on Policy Development for Grey Literature Resources. And as I reviewed that and compared that to what we're doing with Policy Commons, I realized that in fact we're addressing an awful lot of those 15 different points. In fact, we're addressing 10 of them. So yes, we're allocating persistent identifiers to all the content that we pull into Policy Commons. We're able to export the content to bibliographic systems. We're certainly using interoperable standards. We're standardizing and we're developing systems to cope with orphan content so that the content can be collected, can be managed, and licensed if necessary. We're increasing the support for collection development. We certainly are. We're now able to offer 2.7 million items for librarians to add to their collections, and we're preserving that content as we go. And we've certainly invested a significant amount in the infrastructure to both harvest and host the content on our commons. We're tackling link rot. If a link breaks, our persistent identifier system will lead to a copy that we've saved. And we're dealing with non-textual content as much as we're dealing with textual content. So we're addressing a great number of the issues that were identified as problems in 2014 with Policy Commons. So hopefully that the NGO grey elephant will get a little bit smaller as this content becomes standardized and becomes part of the scholarly record. Thank you very much for your attention. If you've got any questions, of course, there are my contact details. Please do get in touch and I'll be very happy to discuss Policy Commons and what we're doing more generally. Thank you. Bye-bye.